Hello, and welcome back to the Caregivers Journal podcast, where we're talking with real caregivers about their caregiving journeys. Welcome, everyone, back to the Caregivers Journal. I am your co-host, Lance A. Slatton, also the host of All Home Care Matters and the author of the All Home Care Matters Official Family Caregivers Guide. I am, as always, joined by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Cindy and Christina from Adaptive Equipment Corner. Welcome, ladies. How are you today?
We are doing well.
Doing very well.
Yeah, it's good to see you guys.
Always good to see you. We are joined by Katie Kristofic. Katie was a family caregiver for her mother, but not the necessarily kind of family caregiver we often think about. She was a long-distance caregiver for the most part, which I think there's a lot of value there, and there's a lot of things that family caregivers can do if they are long-distance caregiving. But she is also now the founder of the Carefullist, a wonderful online resource website. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Katie, I want to kind of just start off with your story. You were a caregiver for your mom. I mentioned, though, you were more or less a long-distance caregiver. When did you first suspect something might be going on with your mom's memory, and what was she diagnosed with?
Sure. Ultimately, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I started noticing problems, it was 2008, 2009. I was traveling a lot, and I would call my mom every day from the road, from somewhere, either a hotel room because I was lonely or on the road because I was bored driving. And I started to notice over time that she was telling me the same couple of things during the week. I thought, oh, well, she was taking care of grandchildren, and she probably just didn't remember, what she had mentioned. And I was calling a lot. So after a while, what do you talk about? But over time, it started happening more and more. And once my son was born, he's my second child, they came to stay with me. I had had a C-section. I had a toddler who we were trying to keep in her regular schedule of going to her little preschool, and I couldn't drive yet. So my parents came to stay with me so they could take her to preschool. And they showed up, and typically my mom would come with food and all of that kind of stuff. She was a really good cook, and I didn't see any food. And I thought, well, that's not like her. I mean, I didn't expect it, I guess you could say, but I was disappointed. Yeah. I was hungry for a couple of things I really thought she was hungry. And as the week went on, I realized, I was showing her how to use my washing machine, and she wasn't understanding because it was different from hers. And she had said something about going to the grocery store, but they never went. Like, my dad would sort of turn the conversation around or whatever. So I was the one cooking during the week. And then a couple of days in, he was born in November. So this was several weeks after his delivery. So we were decorated for the holidays, and we had our Christmas tree up. And she would stand in our dining room and stare at the Christmas tree. And not for 5 minutes, for like 40 minutes.
Wow.
And then talk to me about the same little cluster of ornaments day after day after day. And that is the absolute moment I knew something was really, really.
Yeah. You had mentioned something, Katie, and I was going to ask you, kind of when did you know for sure, but it sounds like that Christmas tree and, just your experience with your mom and dad staying with you. But you mentioned something in your original answer about how dad kind of shifted the conversation. Was dad in denial, or was dad more in protection mode? Or was it a little
protection mode?
Okay.
For sure. They took care of some of my nieces and nephews. My mom loved that. She has always just absolutely loved children. And she was able to function really, really well in their house where they had lived forever. And she knew where everything was. It was a lot of reflex. So she didn't have to think. It wasn't learning new things. She was totally fine in that space. But if you took her out of that space, things were not okay at all.
And I just want to say, how much I appreciate you saying that, because,
Right.
Cindy and Christina, they did home health care. We do home care. We're with some families 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for years on end. Sometimes it's months. Sometimes it's short term. They may have to go into the hospital. We tell families all the time, when you're dealing with somebody that have some form of dementia, Alzheimer's or what have you, they are functioning at a higher level in their familiar surroundings because they've been there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years plus. And you take them out of that environment, you can quickly see their lack of ability to function at a high level. And it's because in their familiar surroundings, that home, that bathroom, that kitchen, that washing machine, the dryer, that's in their long-term memory. That part has not been touched yet by the cognitive decline. But if you take and put them now in a memory care facility or in a nursing home, or you just downsize and put them in a 1-bedroom apartment, they're not going to have the wherewithal necessarily to adapt to that new environment because they can't get it from that short-term memory of, now, Mom, here's where your new bathroom is. They're not going to be able to store that in that long-term memory portion of their brain, and they rapidly decline, and there's a lot of emotion there. There's fear, there's scared, there's anxiety, there's depression, and, anger can come out or sadness can come out. And that's a prime example of what you just described. Did anybody ever explain that to you before, once you got her into the doctor and got a diagnosis, or?
They didn't talk about it a whole lot in that way, and it also took a long time to get a diagnosis. So I started noticing problems 2008, 2009, and then I kept telling myself it can't be that, because she was 61, 62. I mean, she was not old,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So and nobody else seemed to be picking up on it. So my daughter was born in 2010, and I was sidetracked with that. But I do remember having a conversation with my mom when my son was born, I was pregnant with him. She had gotten burp cloths when my daughter was born that worked really well. And they were not like things that I had seen or received from anybody else. And they were very specific. So it wasn't some random package that she would not remember. And she was really excited that she had found them. And I was talking to her about that. She asked me what I needed for my second child, because, you don't need a whole lot more once you already have one. And I said, I could really use some more of those burp cloths because my daughter destroyed the first set. And she knew she should know. And she couldn't put her finger on it. And at first I said, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. But then the next day she asked the same question. What do you need? What should I get for him? And so I told her again, and she didn't remember that we'd had the conversation the day before. And it was the same response of, I should know what you're asking me, but I can't picture it. I can't think of it. And I described it in great detail. And that's when there was a tone in her voice that changed. And I realized it was alarm. Like she knew she should know. I knew she should know.
Right.
And she was scared.
So, Katie, this kind of leads into our next question. And I love that you're talking about this, because I think, especially when it's a family caregiver, I feel like family caregivers, or people in general, they want to know, what is that journey like for their loved one, because it's a progressive disorder, and so talk a little bit more about that, how you, as her daughter, recognized, that alarm in her, and how do you think her journey, how that journey was for her, at least in the initial stages of it?
Sure. So I've been a little wishy-washy on the timeline because I'm telling stories a little bit out of context. So just for some clarity, I noticed there were problems 2008, 2009. I knew for sure something was wrong in 2013. She was not diagnosed until February of 2015.
Okay.
So there was a really long period of time there. And in those years, in those early stages, that's when I noticed her being much more anxious about things and less sure of herself. She was questioning things. we had a holiday, and I've mentioned she was a really good cook. She would host the holidays, and something went wrong with the turkey for Thanksgiving. And I don't remember what year it was, but it was when I was already starting to wonder and a little bit concerned about her. And she kept saying, I've made this forever. I've done this forever. I don't understand what went wrong. And that's when I realized she's starting to have some trouble, not only remembering recipes she hasn't even had to look at in years. Now, when they're in front of her, she can't follow the directions.
Yeah.
And so that was a big thing for me. And that created some fear for me, because it was sort of like, okay, I've suspected, but now, there's too many things happening here that I need to have some conversations with my family about. So during that whole period between when I suspected and when she was diagnosed, there was a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. And that was her response to it. I know other folks who get angry and frustrated. That was not her demeanor. And that was probably the worst part of it from my perspective for her. And for people who haven't traveled the journey, they may not be able to totally understand what I'm saying here, but it was actually a bit of a relief when she progressed to the point that she was no longer afraid. It was a relief for me personally.
So the anxiety, the depression, the lack of confidence, she never really said anything out loud to you about her fear of this. Something isn't right. But okay, that's interesting. Because I think it gets to the point where it's, you start recognizing it, and then it's up to that family member, to kind of take it from there, because, and I know and I know exactly what you're saying. I'm a speech therapist, and, I work mostly in long-term care, in the memory care. So working with my clients and the residents in that community, as well as their caregivers, and so helping them make that transition, into understanding that, things have changed,
Right.
And that's hard, seeing their loved one, make that change and stuff. So, so I really appreciate you saying that. So you kept her, so your mom was, how long was she at home? And kind of tell us a little bit more about her journey, as far as who cared for her, and what, as she progressed, did she go to a facility? Did you take her into your home? Did your dad keep caring for her?
Yeah. She stayed home with my dad the entire time. And she was sick a very long time. She did not pass until September of 2023. So my dad did an exemplary job of taking care of her. My sister lived close by, and so she was the primary backup, and would just come over. She and her husband would come over and help multiple times a week. So they handled things, and then eventually we ended up with hospice. And that started in February of 2020. She was put on hospice a few weeks before the pandemic. And once she was placed on hospice, typically you're placed on hospice when they believe you have about 6 months left to live. And so we started preparing ourselves for that. And she experienced what I think they unofficially call the hospice bump. So sometimes when the change of care happens, or they start doing some different things, patients can level out for a little while, at least with dementia. She didn't level out for a little while. She leveled out for 3.5 years.
Wow. Yeah.
But hospice stayed with us, and they really were an amazing service and support. And I would encourage everyone to have a conversation with hospice sooner rather than later, because you can be eligible before you think you are. I think a lot of people think hospice is for the last few days or the last few hours or whatever. And really, if you think you or your loved one have a year, you should have a conversation, because you can get in the queue and start getting care as soon as they evaluate you to be ready.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
So you had mentioned that your mom was 61. So
Mhm.
that's early onset. And then you have children. So that kind of puts you in the sandwich generation then, doesn't it?
Mhm.
I am the ham and cheese.
You're ham and cheese on rye. I love it. Yeah. So what was it like being a member of the sandwich generation? So caring for your young children and then also caring for, or at least providing some kind of service and care for your mom and your
Sure.
parents.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. Because you don't go into becoming a parent thinking, number one, that your parent isn't going to be available to you in terms of advice and just the general oohing and awing over your perfect child.
Right. Right.
Um, and you certainly don't expect to have to make decisions about their care and
Mhm.
try to figure out how to care for them the way they cared for you.
Right.
And also now raise these children who are completely dependent on you.
Right.
And I was also working at the time. I had a full-time job and career aspirations.
Mhm.
So I did, I think, what a lot of people in my situation do is career-wise, I held myself back.
Mhm.
I didn't push the way I would have.
Mhm.
I didn't seek out opportunities that I would have, or take opportunities that I would have, because the job I had, and I'm very grateful for it, was flexible
Mhm.
and knew my situation. I was comfortable enough to be able to be open about what was going on. And so it worked for what I needed.
Mhm.
So that was, I can't say it was a no-brainer, because
Yeah.
it wasn't. It was a matter of, I've worked really hard to
Yeah.
get to this place.
Yeah.
But of the things, of the priorities, this is just going to have to take a back seat. So explaining dementia to really young children is
My next
super
question.
hard.
Yeah. So your mom was early onset, and so that would have made your kids kind of
She
young.
had
Like
dementia by the
explain
time they were born.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that would be, yeah. So then as they grew to try to understand it, they didn't know any different from,
right.
behavior from your
Yeah,
mom. So
yeah.
what
So
was that like when they got to that point where you had to explain it to them?
yeah, that was interesting. So my kids are 3 years apart. My daughter's the older one. And so she doesn't necessarily have memory, but she can look at a picture and sort of piece it together. It's sort of fuzzy for her, of my mom reading books with them or getting down on the floor and building blocks and things like that. She was not, I would say she was moderate stage by the time my son was born.
Mhm.
So other than watching video, he has absolutely no recollection of her talking whatsoever. He doesn't know what her voice sounds like. Um, he has never had a conversation with her.
Mhm.
My daughter had a conversation with her, but doesn't remember that.
Right.
Gotcha.
So the best way I can explain it is, you have these children who are learning and growing, and then you have this parent who is forgetting and regressing, and they kind of meet right here.
Yep.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I used to try to find activities that all of them could do together, because there was a sweet spot for about a year where they were all on the same activity level.
Yeah.
So I would get those break apart sugar cookies that have the pictures on them for different seasons.
Yep.
And they could do that. They could break the cookies apart and put them on the trays. And then the house would, smell good like sugar cookies. And it would kind of have that um, olfactory trigger for my mom with the smell. And, it would just be a nice thing for all of them. But the thing that I realized in the last week or so, my daughter was working on a project for school and she had to pull some pictures together. And I was showing her a picture I took of her working with my mom and my great aunt, who also actually had Alzheimer's at the time. It was both of them. So it was really 4 generations of
Wow.
craziness for a while.
Mhm.
And they were all working and I was talking to her about it and she didn't remember it. And
Mhm.
so then it was weird for me as the sandwich generation to be the one out of the 4 who even knows that it happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that, when you think about like caregiving and isolation and loneliness, that's kind of the real crux of it. Like,
Right.
well, I was there and there were a bunch of people, but not one of them have any idea it happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Wow.
you'd mentioned that your father did the lion's share of the
Mhm.
caregiving.
Mhm.
But I've also heard you talk about siblings. So
Yep.
did you guys have outside care besides the family, you and your dad and the siblings caring
Mhm.
for you, outside care?
We tried that.
Mhm.
We had, I don't want to call out the agencies. We had a couple of agencies come in, and they just weren't what we needed. Unfortunately, I don't think those folks are supported the way they should be in terms of training, especially for dementia.
Mhm.
And as much as my dad needed a break, he didn't feel good about leaving her in their care.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we went another route, and I would highly recommend this. Um, Through our networking and our local community, we found a couple of retired nurses
Mhm.
who didn't want to give up, the whole nursing thing, but they didn't want to continue the grind either.
Right.
And so my dad felt really good about those ladies coming in and
Mhm.
taking care of my mom because they were certified and they had all of the experience. And they knew my mom was still a person.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
They
huge.
would talk to her and read to her, and she had some good friends who would come and do the same thing.
Mhm.
So we were very fortunate in that way. And in terms of my role, I don't think I touched on this because I live a couple hours away.
Mhm.
I, through the pandemic and before that, was testing out remote work and all of that. And I thought, well, if you can do remote work for work, you can do remote caregiving for sure. Internet's here. There's lots of resources. There's lots of information. Um, it's very time consuming.
Yes.
And this is something that I can do since I am not there hands on to help. I would certainly visit on weekends and stock their freezer with freezer meals and things like that. But Monday through Friday, I couldn't get there. And I couldn't get there every weekend either.
Mhm.
Particularly having little kids, there's lots of illness through the house all the time.
Yeah.
You don't want to be taking that to your parents' house.
Right.
So I would look up different resources for things. So snow removal, landscaping, things like that. Although my dad really liked to do the landscaping, so he never really took me up on that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It was a
Yeah.
good way to some exercise and get out of the house.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. That's interesting, because when we talk about family caregivers, we automatically think, oh, you're the one that's right there,
Mhm.
hands on. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience as far as, first of all, your feelings of, oh, a lot of times you feel guilty when you're the one that can't get there and be the hands on, but we forget about the fact that there are other things that can be done. But tell us a little bit about your experience in dealing with that, with you being the one that was, the further distance away and couldn't actually do a lot of the hands on.
Sure. I'm a communications person by career. So that was my first step, right? It's stick with what you know.
Right.
So I took on updating the family and friends of, what's going on. So my dad didn't have to do that. My sister didn't have to do that. Um, if we needed to talk to the doctor and, we weren't getting follow up or things like that, I took on those phone calls because you can do that from anywhere.
Right.
I started looking into services and things that could deliver things to make things a little bit easier for my dad. So, eventually he really got into Amazon delivery and Instacart and all of that stuff. I will say, you can do all kinds of things, and it doesn't matter what your age happens to be.
Right.
If you work at it and figure it out, or if you have somebody who can help you, I highly recommend it. And he, I think, found and felt some freedom in that and some control in that. Like, okay, well, I can't get to the grocery store, but I can still decide what it is I want, and they will bring it to me.
Right. Right.
Um,
That is awesome. That is awesome. Yeah, being on you were talking about earlier about hospice, and I think it is so important in regards to people knowing, like you said, contact them earlier than you expect, because there's kind of a stigma on the hospice thing, and we think we're just giving up when we, bring hospice in. But I think you're so right on that, and it's interesting for you to let us know that your mom was on hospice for several years, and people don't understand that. They think, oh, they're gonna, it's a done deal basically, and that's kind of harsh, but it's very stigmatized. So I appreciate you saying that and letting us know that's kind of how it went for your mom, because it's very important to bring those other resources in that can be helpful to people that are having dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that, and very helpful to the caregivers at home as well. Is there any specific resource that you can think of that would give, or that you've found that would give people a little bit better understanding of hospice, or any recommendation there, maybe contacting their local hospice to get more information?
I would definitely start contacting your local hospice. There's a book, oh gosh, and I can't remember the name of it. I'll get it to you, and maybe they can put it up across.
Sure.
I want to say it's the blue book. It's a really great explanation of the hospice process and understanding what's coming and accepting what's going to happen. I think we have a tendency, because it's natural, to avoid talking about death and avoid kind of looking it in the eye. But the reality is that it happens to everyone. And the more openly people can talk about it, the more comfortable everyone becomes. And it's not so much a fighting it. It's an acceptance of it. And when you can get to that point, I think people have a more peaceful passing.
Right.
And I think the family has a more peaceful experience as well. Of course, you don't want it to happen.
Right.
I mean, I would say number one worst day of my life.
Right. Right.
But it's kind of tied with diagnosis day. Those two things are neck and neck. But the more you talk about it, and that's why it's so important for me, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to tell her story here. I did not know anyone who was in my situation. Not one person, because I was 32.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
My sister was 28. So none of us had, friends who had parents who were sick, number one, but certainly not dementia.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And, also taking care of babies and all of that. So my sister and I have always been close, but this definitely brought us closer because we didn't have anyone else to lean on who really understood what we were dealing with and going through.
Right. Right. Wow.
It's nice. It's nice. You talk about getting in contact with hospice early, and it was nice understanding and knowing what was going to happen next. I would think that will go along the same line with just dementia in general, knowing that this is kind of where my mom is or my loved one is. What can I expect next? And being at a young age, what did you find anything in your journey that where you could turn to and go, I have no idea what to expect next so that I can prepare myself and my family for this?
I was constantly looking for things like that. I'm a planner anyway. I am type A personality, I'll admit it. So for me as a caregiver and as a daughter, it was really, really hard for me to know we were on this really long road because she was young and otherwise completely healthy.
Right. Right.
And not knowing when that next shoe was going to drop was horrible.
Well,
So
what it will look like.
Yeah.
right. Yes. So the 36-hour day is a book that was really helpful for dementia and Alzheimer's. It gives a very broad view of what could happen because, as anybody who's dealt with dementia knows, it affects every single person differently.
Yeah.
And the response from healthcare staff that you're going to get so tired of hearing is, well, we don't know because it affects everybody differently. And it can really drive you crazy. And it got to me. I mean, I didn't have gray hair before.
Katie, you talk about your mom, and she sounds like an absolutely lovely, lovely person. And I know that you want to tell her story and your story. How do you want people to remember your mom? I mean, what is your thought on that?
Yeah, she is someone who delighted in the little things. And that was the stuff that was really important to her. And making us feel special. They're us as children, I guess I should clarify. There was nothing she wanted more than to be a mom. That was the end all be all for her. And she wanted to do it really, really well. So she would go out of her way to find special wrapping paper for us for our birthdays, whatever we were into that year. She made a big deal out of the holidays, and it was not like the buying of stuff. She had a real talent for making a place feel like home and for making people feel welcome. And talking with my friends growing up and my siblings' friends, throughout this journey, but especially at her passing, the most common thing I would hear from people was entering your house always felt like just getting a big hug. Everybody was welcome. She was always very warm and caring and genuinely wanted to know how you were. And I really miss her.
Yes, I bet. She sounds like an absolutely wonderful woman. Wonderful woman.
Yeah.
In your caregiving and in being a caregiver, even though yours was long distance, that can be all consuming. And when that journey ends, it's that's another tough part of a caregiver's life. How do you make that transition? What are you going to do going forward as far as that transition and since your caregiving journey has ended?
Sure. It can be a really tough thing because caregiving does take up so much of your mental capacity and your time, and it's sort of what you've been doing. To go from that and then to channel that activity or that busy time with the grief that has kind of replaced all of that. And for me, going through the dementia journey, I had a lot of anticipatory grief. So every time we hit a new stage, there was grief. I grieved being right when the diagnosis came back. Didn't want to be right. I grieved when she didn't know when she couldn't remember my name. That was terrible. I grieved when she couldn't speak. She lost her ability to speak, and it wasn't for a short time. It was for years. So then for a while, she would have her reflexive smiles. If we were smiling and laughing about something, that was great. But then that disappeared. And so you have all of that grief and you're going through that while the person is still there. But then when they pass, the grief kind of takes on its own different thing. And so for me, I really needed to find a way not only to channel the grief, but also to find a way that I could still talk about her. Because I think it's really important for people who've lost someone to have many, many, many opportunities to talk about the person they lost and the person they miss. Because if you're given that opportunity, it doesn't feel like they're so far away. It feels like they're still with you in a way. So I decided, because my mom lived a life of service to others, I looked back on what I did for my caregiving journey and the ways that I found that I could still be helpful, even though I wasn't close by. And thinking about looking through all of the information that's out there and how long it takes, because there's so much, and trying to figure out what's right, what's not, what's meant to be helpful, but is a little misguided, and sort of sorting through all of that stuff and coming out with, okay, well, 4 hours later, here are the 2 answers I needed. So I founded a website and social media channels called the Carefullist. And it is a resource or an aggregation of resources for folks who are caregiving. Of course, my background and my experience is dementia, but it also supports folks who are dealing with cancer, ALS, Parkinson's, and special needs. So really long-term care, multiple sclerosis, things like that. The average amount of time a caregiver spends looking online and doing research for their person is over 13 hours every month.
Wow.
And so if I can give people some time back so that they can do what they want to do with their loved one, then I call that a win and an honor.
That is awesome. That is wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. It has been such a pleasure speaking with you, Katie. Lance, do you take us out?
Thank you, ladies. Katie, as always, great to see you. I want to just fill in a couple of blanks for Katie real quick. She's also launching a podcast. Is that right?
I am. Yeah. Carefullist, the podcast.
Carefullist.
Very cool.
All the information is on carefullist.com. Katie, always a joy to see you. Thank you so much for everything you're doing for caregivers and families everywhere. Cindy and Christina, it's time for the Adaptive Equipment Corner Caregiver Tip of the Month.
All right.
All right, great. Well, Cindy, Christina, my co-host, Katie, thank you guys so much. We look forward to seeing everybody again here next month at the Caregivers Journal.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Tough, we're by your side. Adaptive Equipment and Caregiving Corner, your guide. Helping seniors stay strong and free, with love and care and harmony. We'll show you how we'll make it fit. Your health and safety
Thank you for joining us again here this month at the Caregivers Journal podcast, where we're talking with real caregivers about their caregiving journeys. We look forward to seeing you again here next month.